For today's video, I've come out here to Carmel, California to take a look at one of the most important new car launches in America, the all-new 2019 Toyota RAV4. This is the fifth generation of one of the crossovers that helped kickstart the crossover revolution in America. Why is the RAV4 so important? Well, first off, it helped start the crossover revolution, but second, Toyota sells an incredible number of RAV4s. Outside of the pickup truck segment, the RAV4 is simply the best-selling anything in America. Toyota sells more than 400,000 of these a year in the United States. This outsells the Forester, the CX-5, the Terrain, the Sportage, the Tiguan put together. In fact, the Toyota RAV4 outsells Mazda. Everything that Mazda sells in the United States, Toyota sells more RAV4s total. And that's why for 2019, Toyota has decided to give the RAV4 a few more flavors than we've had before. So we have different front-end looks, one that's a little bit more rugged, one that's a little bit less rugged. They're really focusing on their hybrid models, and they've given us optional all-wheel drive systems that are very unique in this segment to help improve and increase the yearly sales of this already very popular model. Most of the models you'll find on the dealer lots, whether you're looking at the gasoline-only version or the hybrid version, will sport this particular look, which is a little bit of 4Runner going on with a little bit of perhaps Toyota Camry and some of the rest of Toyota's passenger car lineup. We have full LED headlamps over here, standard in all models, incandescent turn signals, and halogen fog lamps right down below. Then we have the Adventure Grade, which sports a more rugged look up front, and that's kind of an interesting trim because for 2019, Toyota is definitely trying to focus on more off-road ability in their very popular compact crossover. As with the outgoing model, the new RAV4 is right in the middle of this segment in terms of overall length, and interestingly enough, the new one actually straddles the outgoing model in terms of overall length, with this model being a hair shorter and the optional Adventure model actually being a hair longer at 181.5 inches long. That's mainly due to the different bumper that we see in that trim. Be sure and let me know what you think about the overall design down there in the comment section below. I have to say that I find the new RAV4 quite a bit more attractive than the outgoing model. I never cared for that model's looks, and I actually think this is now one of the more attractive entries in this particular segment. It's not as elegant as something like a Mazda CX-5, but it's definitely an awful lot more rugged looking. In my mind, the overall design combines elements from something like the 4Runner, the Jeep Grand Cherokee, etc., with these squared off wheel arches right here, a little bit of Volvo XC40 going on right back here, and then a little bit of Toyota's pickup truck in the overall front end design. Out back, we have combination lamp modules, which is automotive speak for LED tail lamps, and then incandescent other elements. So the turn signal, the backup lights, those are incandescent elements. The rear end definitely looks more stylized than the last RAV4, and last RAV4 was definitely a little bit boring back here. We have well-integrated parking sensors, twin exhaust tips down there at the bottom, and some style that mirrors the grille up front. For 2019, Toyota seriously increased the ride height of the RAV4. We now find 8.1 to 8.6 inches of clearance. That means that most models will be at least 2 inches higher off the ground than the last generation RAV4, and the top-end Adventure trim will actually be almost the same ride height as a Subaru Forester or a Jeep Cherokee. That will really help improve not only the off-road ability of this vehicle, but also performance in snowy situations. As with the last generation RAV4, we find a hybrid and a non-hybrid model available in America, but the engines are actually quite different. The base model uses a 2.5-liter four-cylinder engine borrowed from the Toyota Camry. It produces 203 horsepower, 184 pound-feet of torque, and is mated to the same 8-speed automatic that we find in the Camry and some Lexus models. You can get that model with either front-wheel drive, all-wheel drive, or an all-wheel drive system with a torque vectoring rear axle. The torque vectoring all-wheel drive setup is a little bit more similar to what we see from some General Motors products and a little bit less like what we see in Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system. Because although this all-wheel drive system can send 100% of the power destined for the rear to a single rear wheel, it cannot overdrive that rear wheel like we see in the Acura systems. That's the key difference there. Fuel economy comes in at 29 miles per gallon for most trims, regardless of whether you choose front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive, because both all-wheel drive systems feature a rear axle disconnect system that actually removes the rear axle from the equation and helps improve fuel economy. If you get the Adventure or the Limited trim, then we do drop down to 27 miles per gallon combined. If fuel economy is your thing, we still have a hybrid system under this hood, making this one of the only hybrid options in this particular segment. The hybrid system is based off of what we see in the Toyota Camry. It uses basically the same 2.5-liter four-cylinder engine that produces 176 horsepower in its own right, and then it uses a twin motor system, which is a little bit different than the Camry. Toyota tells us that the extra horsepower versus the Camry hybrid system really has to do with that electric motor in the rear and the way the battery and other systems have been tuned specifically for the RAV4. But very much like the Camry, the hybrid model is actually faster than the base 4-cylinder model. So if you want the best in performance, you actually want the hybrid. And of course, it goes without saying that if you want the best in fuel economy, you want the hybrid as well, because this gets 39 miles per gallon combined, and the electric rear axle is standard on the RAV4. As I said earlier, unlike Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system, this vehicle cannot overdrive the rear axle, and that is the key to the Acura system sending 70% of engine power at certain speeds to a single rear wheel. This vehicle, in theory, would be able to direct about 50% of engine power to a single rear wheel. It could theoretically lock that center coupling, disconnect one of the rear wheels, and then send all the power to this rear wheel, so 50% split between the two front wheels, and then 50% going to a single rear wheel. There's some obvious off-road benefits to that, of course, because it'll help you get out of stickier situations, but the on-road benefit to that is that we can actually overdrive the outside rear wheel when you're cornering, and that actually helps the car turn in a little bit better. So this is going to feel perhaps a little bit more like an Acura RDX than some of those other entries in this particular segment. But again, the Acura is going to give you a little bit more power to the single rear wheel. The overall front seat design is very similar to the last generation RAV4. We have two-way adjustable lumbar support that is powered and a multi-way adjustable power driver's seat. We then have a manual tilt telescopic steering column. As we see in most of the competitors in this segment, the passenger seat does not have the same range of motion as the driver's seat. In terms of overall seat comfort, although the design of the seat is very similar to the last generation model, I actually find this seat design a little bit more comfortable. We sink into it a little bit more, the lumbar support is a little bit more pronounced and a little bit higher on the seat, which I personally prefer. The model that we're in right now has a 2-position seat memory over there on the door as well. Headroom is pretty generous in this segment, but if you do get the moonroof, then you should know that headroom drops pretty significantly. Now, this model does have the moonroof in it, and even so, I still have comfortably about 2 inches of headroom left with the front seat adjusted for me. Hopping into the back seat, we actually find a little bit less legroom than we found in the 2018 RAV4. That's just due to the overall dimensional changes in the vehicle, even though the wheelbase is actually a little bit longer in this model. That said, however, the rear seats are actually more comfortable than the outgoing RAV4. The seat bottom cushion is a little bit close to the ground for my tastes, but that's probably going to be more comfortable for children or smaller folks. But you can see I still have a generous amount of legroom sitting right here behind myself at 6 feet tall. So I still have about 6 or 7 inches of legroom left. This is definitely still generous for this particular segment. Headroom is also pretty generous, even though we're in the model with the optional moonroof. Now, things do drop a little bit more if you get the panoramic moonroof. This particular interior has the standard moonroof, so it actually steps right back up right here in this area, and then over my head, I have about 3 inches of headroom left. You'll definitely find less in some of the competition. That allows me to move over to the middle seat and still be able to sit very comfortably here. I have about 2 inches of headroom left right there in the middle. Moving all the way over to the right side of the vehicle where this front seat was all the way back in its tracks, I still have several inches left. The rear seats also recline in this generation of RAV4, which is a nice touch. I pull this seat lever right there, the same one that I used to fold the seat, and it allows me about an extra inch of recline. It's not quite as generous as we see in some of the competitors, but it still moves, and that is a little bit handier. We also have a few nicer touches back here than in the last generation model. We have a wider fold-down center armrest with 2 cup holders. We actually find air vents in the center console, and the overall fit and finish and materials quality is definitely above the last RAV4. One of the strong selling points of the RAV4 has long been the large cargo area compared to the average entry in this segment, even though the RAV4 is not necessarily the longest entry. At 37.6 cubic feet of storage space, the cargo area has actually shrunk a little bit versus 2018, although it is still near the top of the segment. The CR-V gets 39.2 cubic feet of storage space, but something like a Jeep Cherokee only has 24.8, so it's notably smaller than this. Although we haven't had the opportunity to run this through our usual 24-inch roller bag test, because of the only slight drop, I expect this actually to fit the same number of 24-inch roller bags. The cargo area features a pretty rigid load floor, which is a nice touch, and then under that we actually find a temporary spare tire, which is something that we don't see in all compact crossovers. Toyota is very proud of this dual height load floor, which we have seen in other crossovers out there. It allows you to slide this to a position that's a little bit lower. The reason that we have this dual height load floor is that this upper height allows the load floor to be level with the rear passenger seats. And if we put it in the lower height, you would actually have to step up in order to push bags up there to the rear seats. Going for a quick spin around the interior, we have an available rear camera setup right there. I've seen that in other vehicles out there. We have a sunglass holder, controls for the moonroof right there. This particular model has a pretty standard sized moonroof, but there is a panoramic moonroof available if you're interested. The driver and front passenger have height adjustable shoulder belts and two-way adjustable headrests. There are a variety of different upholstery options available. This particular interior has the Softex upholstery, so this is an imitation leather product, not real leather. It is perforated in the center because these seats are both heated and ventilated, and it's a little bit difficult to tell in this video, but you're not seeing shadows. These seats are actually a two-tone design, so the perforated center section there is actually a slightly different color than the outboard bolsters. The bolsters are not terribly aggressive, so this is going to be a little bit easier for larger folks or smaller folks to find an ideal driving position, although some smaller people may slip around a little bit. The front doors are made from a large portion of soft touch materials, which is actually an upgrade from what we see in most of the competitors. So the upper section right here with the stitching right there in contrast, that's actually a soft touch material, as is this ivory section right there in the middle. And then the lower portions of the door panel, for instance, around that bottle holder or the speaker grill, those are actually hard plastics. Moving from the doors on over to the dashboard, we find a combination of an injection molded upper section and then a stitched middle section right here that we've seen in other Toyota vehicles, again with more of that contrasting stitching. If I zoom in on there, you'll notice this is actually brown in this particular model. If you get the adventure grade, which we'll take a look at in a bit, then we get orange accents. We then have a pretty deep storage cubby right there where you could very easily put large smartphones, and they will definitely nest right in that particular cavity. There's also one over on the driver's side that's a little bit smaller, but still enough to hold a large smartphone. Below that, we find a bin-style glove compartment. I suspect that larger tablets would have trouble fitting inside there. In the middle of the dashboard, we find two different infotainment systems, a standard 7-inch LCD and an optional 8-inch LCD, which is what we're looking at right here. It's perched high atop the dashboard to help improve your line of vision if you're playing with the system right here. As you can see, we have Apple CarPlay integration, but Android Auto support is still missing in action. That's due to some disagreement about what Google is collecting when you're using Android Auto. Toyota tells us that they're still in negotiations with Google about that. They hope to have Android Auto at some point in the future. We do have Amazon Alexa integration if you're not using an Apple smartphone. In addition to the Apple mapping interface through Apple CarPlay, you also have the availability of optional factory navigation and, of course, all the usual interfaces that you'd expect in Toyota's infotainment system, including integrated apps over there with the apps button. You'd be able to use those if I didn't have an Apple CarPlay device connected to the system. If I disconnected my smartphone, you'd be able to use those particular apps. Below the infotainment system, we have two pretty standard-sized air vents, the controls for the optional dual-zone automatic climate control system, controls for the heated and ventilated seats. Then we have a storage cubby where we have a USB input, power port, and a wireless charging mat. We then have a pretty standard gear shift right there. Drive is all the way back. We then have a sport mode over to the left, push away from the driver for gear up, pull towards the driver for gear down. Electric parking brake, auto brake hold, drive mode buttons here, eco, normal, and sport. And then this controls the optional all-wheel drive traction system. We can press for normal, we rotate around for rock, and then rotate to the left for the mud and sand mode. There are just those three modes right there. If you're in the hybrid, even though it has a hybrid all-wheel drive system, the controls are a little bit different. We then have a snow button and then a hill descent control button. Continuing down from there, we have two pretty large cup holders. I suspect these will have no problems accommodating large American takeout drinks. Between the front seats, we have a padded center armrest. This opens to reveal a moderately sized storage compartment with a little divider right there. We find some additional charge ports right here, two USB ones, although these do not interface with the infotainment system. Over on the driver's side, we find two different instrument clusters, both with LCDs. This is the optional model with the larger LCD right there in the center. In addition to giving us our pretty typical trip computer readouts, this display also changes based on the drive mode that we're in. So for instance, if we move over to rock and dirt, it'll show you a power distribution icon right there so you can see where the power is going. If I move over to mud and sand, you'll notice that it turns off the pre-collision systems as well as the traction control system, because it actually is designed to give you more wheel slip, which you'd want if you were in a muddy or sandy situation, rather than trying to reduce power and reduce wheel slip, which is more what you want on rock and dirt. The steering wheel is basically the same as the one that we find in the Camry and other Toyota models. It's a 3-spoke design with solid spokes on the side and sort of a split spoke right there at the bottom. If you move down into the lower end trims of the RAV4, then instead of the Softex stitched section right there in the middle of the dash, we actually get an injection molded piece that has then been after stitched to still give it sort of a premium appearance. And then moving back over here to the doors, we actually find hard plastics at the top of the door, but we still find a soft touch armrest right down there at the bottom. The portion of soft touch material just shrinks notably when you look at the lower end trims versus that top end trim we were just in. The other key change is that we don't have a knob for the all-wheel drive mode selection. Instead, we just have buttons over here in the standard all-wheel drive model. That's because this version does not have that torque vectoring axle in the back. We still get the same basic modes, however. We get rock and dirt, mud and sand, snow, normal, sport, and eco. We just don't have that knob. The lower end instrument cluster uses that smaller screen, as you can see right in the middle, and then a physical speedometer on the right. Although the screen is definitely smaller, we get basically the same readouts in that center LCD. First, let's talk about performance figures. We ran from 0 to 60 in 8 seconds flat in the all-wheel drive version and in the front-wheel drive version. The reason those two models are basically the same is that even though the all-wheel drive version has better traction and we do get a tiny bit of wheel chirp in this front-wheel drive version, we have the added weight and added loss of the all-wheel drive system. So the two vehicles ended up about 1/100th of a second apart. Basically, that's within the margin of error for our 0 to 60 testing equipment. We haven't had the opportunity to do our brake testing since we aren't on our usual home turf, but I expect that this is probably going to be in the 118 to 120 foot range based on the tires that we have in this vehicle and the overall curb weight. Expect the hybrid version of the RAV4 to be a little bit longer than this because of the added weight. With that out of the way, let's talk about the category that I have been most asked about. How does the RAV4 handle? There's been a lot of press about the torque vectoring rear axle in the RAV4. This is a very unique item in the mainstream compact crossover segment. A number of manufacturers out there advertise that they have torque vectoring or torque control, whatever they want to call it, but outside of this RAV4, all those manufacturers are using a brake-based system. So they're using the actual brakes in the vehicle, the anti-lock brake controller, to brake a single rear wheel and sort of slow it down to try and send torque across to the other side of the vehicle. Those systems are not as well balanced as a mechanical torque vectoring axle, and they don't have the same kind of power capability that we have in a torque vectoring axle like this. However, if you were hoping that this would behave more like Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system, more like the new Acura RDX, then you may be a little bit disappointed because, as I said earlier, this system cannot overdrive the rear wheels. It cannot make them spin faster or send more than about 50% of engine power to the rear wheels when they're slipping. It's also worth noting that Toyota's software does not send as much power to the rear axle as we see in that next category up, the luxury category. Toyota likely does that in order to help improve fuel economy and overall longevity of the drivetrain components, because the more power you send to the rear, the sooner they're going to wear out, the more reliability problems you may create later. So Toyota has been a little bit less aggressive than Acura in sending power to the rear. But it is interesting that we're even having the conversation of Toyota RAV4 versus Acura when it comes to handling. When you're out on your favorite winding mountain road, the torque vectoring rear axle is noticeable. But I've been able to drive the front-wheel drive, the standard all-wheel drive, and the torque vectoring all-wheel drive systems back to back on this winding mountain road out here, and the difference is actually a little bit more subtle than you might think. If you are really pressing the vehicle hard on a tight winding mountain road, you actually can feel the torque vectoring helping you around the corner. Things are going to feel a little bit sharper than the regular all-wheel drive system. But the difference is not night and day, and it doesn't have that rear biased feel that an Acura sometimes can. Now, Acura's super handling all-wheel drive will not always send more power to the rear, but it will, under certain circumstances, generally full throttle, lower speeds, etc., it will actually send a lot of power to the rear. This system is not quite that aggressive, but again, still more capable than any of the other entries in this segment. So when it comes to overall handling ability, I actually like the way this feels more than something like the Mazda CX-5. The CX-5, like many Mazdas in America, does not really focus on overall actual grip. Instead, Mazda focuses on handling feel, which is very good in the CX-5, and I think it is a little bit more communicative in terms of overall steering than the RAV4, but when it comes to actual grip and the way that the system rotates the vehicle around, I actually think the RAV4 beats it, especially with that torque vectoring system. I would say this ends up actually being fairly comparable to most trims of the Kia Sportage, which is one of the better handling options in this segment at the moment. Top-end trims of the Sportage improve their grip by giving you much wider tires than we find in mainstream trims of the RAV4, but the RAV4 gives us that torque vectoring ability to help get you around the corners. When it comes to handling, the suspension design that we find in the RAV4 really helps out here as well. Remember that this is related to the new Toyota Camry, and the Camry has really turned over a new leaf in its latest generation. That's thanks to the overall design of the front suspension and especially the rear suspension. This now uses a multi-link independent rear suspension, which is definitely more advanced than the last generation of the RAV4 and definitely more advanced than some of the competition in this segment. The difference is really noticeable when you really start pushing the RAV4 harder out on your favorite winding mountain road. The rear end does not feel unsettled over broken pavement like some of the entries in this segment can. Because the suspension in the vehicle is always moving up and down, that has the effect of really improving overall grip. It also has the effect of improving the ride in the RAV4. This ride is a little on the firm side, but it's not harsh and it soaks up those smaller imperfections out on the road very well. Overall suspension tuning can be a little bit tricky in crossovers like this because shoppers expect this kind of vehicle to be able to handle well out on a winding mountain road like this, and then when the going gets a little bit tougher and you get onto a rough gravel road, they don't expect to have their teeth knocked out. Now the adventure trim of the RAV4 is tuned a little bit softer. You definitely notice that there's a little bit more body roll, a little bit more tip and dive in that model. It is definitely more tuned to that soft road or off-road kind of situation. So if you do live down a gravel road or you're out in the country and you're looking for a small crossover, the adventure trim actually I think would be a good option if you can afford it, because it does get that slightly different suspension tune and it helps soak up some of those larger road imperfections on a rougher road. If you live in town and you go occasionally out to the country, then this is actually still going to be a good option. Remember that this generation of the RAV4 actually has significantly increased ride height versus the last generation, so the overall handling ability of this RAV4, which is above the last model, is actually a little bit more surprising than you might think. We haven't been able to do our official cabin noise test, but I suspect this is going to be pretty average in this segment. It's not the quietest in this segment, When it comes to overall cabin noise, we haven't been able to do our official testing, but I expect that this is probably going to be fairly average in this segment overall. As with many compact crossovers in America, we definitely hear more engine noise than we find in a mid-size sedan. So if you're looking for something quieter, the Camry is going to be quieter than this. We also get a little bit more wind noise overall than a mid-size sedan. I mentioned a mid-size sedan here because in terms of overall pricing, compact crossovers tend to actually be closer to mid-size sedans than compact sedans overall. When it comes to fuel economy, 29 miles per gallon according to the EPA is pretty impressive, but if you move up to this limited trim or cross to the adventure grade, then things drop down to 27 miles per gallon. Overall, that's still a pretty decent fuel economy score in this segment for a vehicle that does not have a continuously variable transmission. If you're not a fan of the way CVTs behave and you want to avoid what you find in the Nissan Rogue or the Honda CR-V, then this is going to be a good option. This is the same 8-speed automatic transmission that we find under the hood of the Toyota Camry, the Lexus ES, and interestingly enough, the BMW X1, X2, Volvo XC40, etc. This is an Aisin 8-speed automatic transmission. Overall, the RAV4 is definitely a different vehicle than the previous generation model. That one was a little bit ponderous, a little bit soft, definitely on the slow side. Even though this is not exactly exciting as far as acceleration goes, this is faster than the outgoing model, and if you get the hybrid model, then it will go even faster. But I think the big difference is that the last generation RAV4 didn't really feel like the overall chassis design could handle more power, and this generation does. So I'm actually a little bit sad that Toyota is not offering a higher horsepower engine under this hood, either a 3.5-liter V6 from one of their other products like the Camry, or a 2-liter turbo like something out of the Lexus NX perhaps. Be sure and let me know what you think about a sport model of the RAV4 down there in the comments section below. Would you be interested if they made one? Something like a 2-liter turbo out of the Lexus NX, and of course the torque vectoring axle that we find in this model. Toyota set up an off-road course for the RAV4. It wasn't exactly challenging, so the only part I filmed was this mogul setup. This really highlights the torque vectoring ability of the rear axle because it will actually function like a limited slip differential when you're doing deliberate off-roading like this. Now the driver of the RAV4 is very deliberately keeping the vehicle on top of those teeter-totters in order to highlight the way that that rear axle works. But you can see right here that it is definitely sending power to the left while stopping the right side back there from spinning. Now it is worth noting that we don't have that same sort of torque vectoring ability on the front axle. Instead, it is relying on the traction control system in order to send power left and right, pretty much like any of the other crossovers out there. As a company, Toyota has been very aggressive at bringing their latest active safety technologies down to even their lower end and base trims. That's a little bit different than we see from some of the competition. The result is that even the base LE trim of this vehicle gets radar adaptive cruise control, lane keeping assistance, pedestrian detection, cyclist detection, and of course automatic high beams. That's enabled by a standard camera right here behind the windscreen and a radar sensor behind the Toyota logo. As you're comparing the RAV4 to the competition, keep those features in mind because while some of the manufacturers may include features like autonomous emergency braking, they don't include radar adaptive cruise control and the full suite of safety systems that we see standard in the RAV4. Now let's get to the nitty-gritty. Gasoline versions of the RAV4 should start filtering into dealer lots right around the time you're watching this video, perhaps around early December. If you want the hybrid model, then you will have to wait a few months. We expect to find that on dealer lots sometime around April of the 2019 calendar year. The base model will start at $25,500. That would be for the LE front-wheel drive trim. That's about $840 more than the 2018 model year vehicle. Selecting all-wheel drive will bump you up to at least $26,900, but it's worth noting that we not only get $2,000 more standard equipment in the base front-wheel drive and base all-wheel drive models, but both of those models also get 29 miles per gallon combined. Even though the highway and the city numbers bop around a little bit, we get the same combined score thanks to the new disconnectable rear axle that we find in this model. The next step up from there would be the base hybrid trim at $27,700. That's actually a $1,000 decrease over the 2018 model year, and that'll get you 39 miles per gallon and the electric all-wheel drive system. Although the hybrid system and its electric rear axle is arguably not as capable as the mechanical all-wheel drive system in the gasoline-only RAV4, especially the one with the torque vectoring rear axle, it will save the average owner money over the lifetime of the vehicle. And it really won't take that long to start saving cash because you get that 10 mile per gallon bump. A mid-level trim would set you back about $30,000. For that $30,000 price tag, you could choose an XLE hybrid, or you could get a front-wheel drive XLE Premium. That puts the RAV4 right in the thick of things in this segment, very similar to comparably equipped versions of the Honda CR-V, the Kia Sportage, or the Hyundai Tucson. A hybrid limited trim of the RAV4 will start at $35,700 with no options. But if you add everything to your RAV4 hybrid, this will still end up a little bit less expensive than some of the competition's options. Now, we don't find some of those more powerful engine options in the RAV4 that we do find in the competition, but this is still going to be a little bit less expensive and notably more fuel efficient. Toyota promised with this generation of the RAV4 that they would deliver a much more engaging driving experience, definitely improved drivetrains and improved fuel economy, and that's exactly what they've given us. I'm actually really impressed with the new RAV4. I wish it had a little bit more power, I have to admit that, especially in the model with the torque vectoring rear axle. But as it is, it's still a very unique option in this segment, and it helps the RAV4 handle better than most of the other crossovers available when they're comparably equipped. And again, that comparably equipped line is very important to understand. So vehicles with similar tire sizes and of course tire compounds, the RAV4 actually handles better than most of them, even though this has a ride height that again is very comparable to the Forester or even the Jeep Cherokee. In addition to that, Toyota has given us all of their latest active safety systems standard on even that base $25,500 model. That's something that we don't really see from all the competitors out there. So the radar adaptive cruise control system, the lane keeping assistance, pedestrian detection, cyclist detection, etc., all of that is included in even that base trim. And then finally, we have that no compromises hybrid model. For an extra $800, we get 10 more miles per gallon, and we don't lose any of the interior practicality that we find in the base model because they position that battery pack under the rear passenger seats, and unlike the Toyota Camry, we don't even lose any headroom on the inside versus the gasoline-only trim. If my money were on the line and I really didn't need that extra off-road ability of the mechanical all-wheel drive system, and I was willing to give up a little bit in terms of overall handling ability versus the torque vectoring option, the hybrid would definitely be on my shopping list. And it's a very unique entry in this segment because it's quite different in terms of overall design and in terms of overall on-road performance than the only other hybrid in this segment, which would be the Nissan Rogue hybrid. And perhaps more importantly, there are more compromises with the Rogue's hybrid system in terms of where they have placed the battery and in terms of overall on-road dynamics for the Rogue versus this new RAV4. This really has been a revolution for the RAV4, not an evolution, and I'm really happy that Toyota put the extra effort into this. Now, of course, you will have to wait until we can get our hands on one for a complete week for our usual battery of tests, but at the moment, I can say if you are shopping for a compact crossover, definitely put the RAV4 at the top of your shopping list. That's not something I could say about the 2018 model year vehicle. Its assets really were in its predicted reliability, resale value, etc., very cerebral benefits, but this one is definitely more of an emotional choice than in the past. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. Of course, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already done so. Click on those related videos, including the review of the recently released Subaru Forester, which I think is an excellent competitor in base form to this particular model. Also, be sure to head over to facebook.com/AlexNauto so you can see what I'm driving this week. Click up there to the top of your screen if you want to support this channel, and I'll see you next week.